Zavdivar restoran și da mera mak pulebi Kiła pechy skule pidał Wasz paus chedał ma salce Me musiałem zabrał gazę Zamyt chles magre to sam tasi Magra mi da restoran și da restoran și da restoran și Magra mi da restoran și da restoran și da restoran și Magra mi da restoran și da mea ram haus limuzini Magra gazır da benzini da me çavç da bi da me troši Da zaval sam bedroši da Ova metke v parlament Da mi kamen monument Da mere moklav revizors Mocer televizors Da revizors Da revizors Mocer televizors Da revizors Da revizors Mocer televizors
Lewis Siegelbaum, welcome to Reimagining Soviet Georgia. Thank you for joining us. Could you just tell us, our audience, a little bit about who you are and what you've done?
I was born in 1949 in the Bronx borough of New York City, second son of Morton and Blanche Siegelbaum, themselves New York-born Jews, though children of immigrants from the Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires, grandparents from Odessa, from Riga, Bialystok, and a small town in Galicia that nobody's ever heard of called Kolomea. My interest in Soviet history didn't, however, derive from my family background, at least not consciously, but rather from my father's politics. In 1939, just after becoming a history teacher in the New York City public school system, my father joined the Communist Party of the United States, and he remained a teacher and a communist until 1953, when the teachers' union leadership, under pressure from the New York City Board of Education, decided to purge its ranks of communists. This was, of course, McCarthyism. I was too young at the time to know what was going on, but as I grew older, the subject of communism, the Soviet origins of my father's faith, which persisted until the day he died in 2008, fascinated me. My own political orientation was on the left. I don't remember exactly when I started considering myself a Marxist, but it probably was in my teens. I went after high school to Columbia University, where I was an undergraduate in the late 1960s. And that meant that I was part of SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society. Apart from the radical politics in which I engaged at Columbia, which included student uprising in the spring of 1968. I studied political science under Stephen Cohen and the Russian language. After graduating in 1970, I went to Oxford to pursue my doctorate in Russian history. When it came to choosing a topic for my dissertation, contemporary politics had as much to do with it as anything else. This was toward the end of the Vietnam War, and I wondered about the nexus of war, capitalism, bourgeois support for the war, and anti-war sentiment, and in the case of Russia, revolution. So I ended up writing a dissertation on the war industries committees in Russia during the First World War. The research for the dissertation took me to Moscow in 1973-74. That was my first visit to the Soviet Union. I spent 10 months there on the US-Soviet exchange program, living in MGU, Moscow State University. I received my degree and took up a teaching position in Melbourne, Australia. And it was in the first years I was there that I began to develop a strong interest in social history and specifically labor history. E.P. Thompson's Making of the English Working Class was a big influence. I started researching and writing about Soviet workers. I wrote about the phenomenon of so-called socialist competition and eventually the Stakhanovite movement dedicated to increasing labor productivity. This led to work on labor discipline, on industrial accidents, and related subjects. I wrote a book on Soviet state and society in the 1920s. And in 1989, I participated in a project that took me to the Donbas, specifically Donetsk. And for about 10 years thereafter, I tracked the emergence and fate of the miners' movement across the Soviet, post-Soviet divide. During the 1990s, I got to know historians in Russia more closely, none more so than Andrei Konstantinovich Sokolov. With him and his protege, Sergei Zhuravlyov, I put together a collection of documents from Soviet archives that became Stalinism as a way of life. Around the same time, I collaborated with Jim von Geldern to produce a website called 17 Moments in Soviet History. This is a website that's loaded with archival documents, clips from Soviet movies, and especially newsreels that we obtained from the film and photographic archives in Krasnogorsk outside of Moscow. And the site is dedicated to assisting in the teaching of Soviet history. Each moment corresponded to a year in Soviet history.
What was it like being a man of the left, teaching about the USSR, researching the USSR at the height of the Cold War in the United States and in the West?
Well, as I mentioned, I started my teaching career in far-off Australia in the mid-1970s. Australia being a loyal ally or puppet of the United States when it came to foreign policy and the West's alliance. The mid-1970s, though, was an interesting period in the history of the Cold War in that it was really at the height of détente. Although within a very short period of time, things got more tense, partly in relation to U.S. support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and the Soviet invasion of that country, which cast a pall over Soviet-American relations at the end of the 70s and the early 80s. And when I returned to the US and started teaching at Michigan State University in 1983, the Cold War was back in full tilt. And I'll confess that had both positive and negative effects when it came to the teaching of Soviet history. The positive was that students were keen to learn something about enemy number one, the big bear, the ferocious Soviet Union. So indifference was, shall we say, less of a problem than it was, according to many of my colleagues teaching other histories. The negative, of course, is that students, like most other Americans, absorbed a great deal of the stereotypes and negative images that pervaded the mass media, and otherwise from elsewhere had absorbed these kinds of influences. So when I taught Soviet history, I did everything I could to make students realize that people in the Soviet Union were, well, if not exactly like us, certainly similar in many ways, and did not behave like the automatons that all too many Americans assumed Soviet people were. I eventually became quite fond of showing and discussing weepy Soviet films to humanize Soviet people. I remember showing The Cranes Are Flying, Letyat Zhuravlyi. The English is Three Poplars on Ivy Street. Yeah, Tri Topolia na Pjushich. Wonderful story about a woman from the countryside who comes into Moscow to visit a relative and winds up in a taxi during a rainstorm, and she and the taxi driver realize that they're quite fond of each other. And of course, Moscow Does Not Believe in Tears, this film from the early 1980s. I also assigned fiction like Natalia Baranskaya's A Week Like Any Other, about a woman, a mother in Moscow, exhausted by the so-called double burden. I assigned personal accounts like Edouard Dunet's Notes of a Red Guard, Yevgenia Ginsburg's Journey into the Whirlwind, and Nina Lugovskaya's Diary of a Soviet Schoolgirl. I think all of these help to personalize Soviet history for students who, for the most part, had never encountered a person from that part of the world, and it seemed were unlikely to do so in the future. Of course, when I started teaching in the 70s, a lot of these things had not yet become available in English translation or on film. But eventually things improved.
What role or how do you feel like especially in this period when you were teaching towards the end of the Cold War, this relationship between sort of popular American anti-communism and the type of work you were trying to do, how did they interact, conflict, both inside, but also I'm curious, like outside the classroom? You know, was there moments when, you know, you were coming and trying to propose some more nuanced and humanized view of the USSR, and you were able to kind of like bring that outside of just the discussion in the classroom to sort of engage with the popular anti-communism of the time?
I'll speak specifically to labor history, if I may. One of the big stereotypes or images of the Soviet Union with respect to workers, the working class, the promise of the emancipation of labor, is this completely erroneous claim that, according to Soviet ideology and Soviet leaders, the Soviet Union was a workers' paradise. That the Soviet Union had created a utopia for workers. There's absolutely no evidence, and I've looked into this, that Soviet leaders from Lenin onwards claimed that the country they were leading was a workers' paradise. Neither Stalin nor anyone else referred to the Soviet Union as a workers' paradise. A workers' state? Yes. And that was bad enough because it soon became apparent that the Bolsheviks had decided the workers needed guidance because they were too backward or too impoverished or to this or to that. But the Soviet Union is a workers' paradise? Never. This dim, distant future, was held out there as an objective. The end point of history might be a workers' paradise, but as a description of reality, no. Now, so I wondered, where did this come from, and why was it so pervasive? And when I say it's pervasive, all you have to do is Google workers' paradise, Soviet Union, and tons of stuff come up. So in 1937, an American journalist by the name of Eugene Lyons published a book called Assignment in Utopia. Lyons had been a leftist, pro-communist, although not a member of the party, journalist who went to the Soviet Union in the 1920s, lived there for a number of years, then got disillusioned and came back and wrote about all the terrible things that he had witnessed in the land that communists supposedly claimed was a utopia. And if that weren't bad enough, 30 years later, he compounded his crime by publishing a book called Workers' Paradise Lost: 50 Years of Soviet Communism. Now, of course, it's hard to tell how influential these things are, but in some of this searching that I did to find out where and when such images emerged, I came across an interesting exhibition that was held in 1942 called Das Soviet Paradies. You know where it was held? In Berlin. So this was the Nazis showing how awful things were in the Soviet Union, the supposed workers' paradise. Yeah. So that's a long way of answering your question about, the images and the stereotypes and the ways in which certain assumptions about the nature of the Soviet Union and what Soviet leaders were trying to do or how they conceived of what they were doing have been so badly distorted that you have to unravel these things before you can get at what they actually were trying to do.
Wait, just to clarify, in 1942, the term paradise was used as a pejorative kind of by the Nazi regime when they were having this exhibition.
Yeah, I've got the full title here. It's Aufstellung der Reichspropaganda Leitung. Yeah, Das Soviet Paradies.
In 1942, yeah?
Yeah, Berlin. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, I was just gonna say it sounds about right.
So this actually is really, really helpful, this sort of how these things come to be, because then it becomes so strong and such a strong imagery, then you are no longer able to even come up with another one, because this idea of how it is. But it's like, for mostly, the phrases are, we are building communism. It's this idea of like,
Right.
we are in process. And so the joke sometimes in Georgia will go is, now after 30 years of capitalism, they'll say, how in communism they told us we're always building communism, but we never got there. Now they're telling us we're building capitalism, but we're not getting there either. So it's like this, everyone's like, just trust the process. So what is it like then? Can you tell us more about how different Soviet leaders, if you remember on top of your head, this is sort of a Herculean task, I'm telling you. But like, what are some of the ways that they have conceived the Soviet Union? And are there any differences between, say, Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, and so on, Gorbachev? Well, Gorbachev, we know, was the worst, but still one of the ways that they would talk about the Soviet Union to themselves and others.
Yeah. Well, so just the quick run through is that, 2 steps back, 1 step forward, things were so chaotic and desperate in the early years that, Lenin accommodated elements of capitalism as a way of trying to get back to where they were, as so to speak, in terms of productivity and so forth. Hence the so-called new economic policy of the 20s, which, among other communist leaders, was assumed that would last a long time. Indeed, Lenin at some point indicated, seriously and for a long time, was the phrase. And it was a phrase that Bukharin invoked frequently. On the left, there was a certain impatience and concern about capitalist restoration. Trotsky being articulate about that. By the end of the 20s, with Trotsky ousted, Stalin makes his move, and there's this tremendous mobilization of everything to accelerate the building of communism. And, after all the chaos and bloodshed of the first 5-year plan of collectivization and industrialization and, deportations and so forth, there's the so-called Victors' Congress in 1934, the 17th Party Congress, at which, exploitative classes have been eliminated. We're on the road. Road is, of course, a favorite metaphor for, party policy. And, socialism has been achieved. We're on the road to the next phase. Well, that tends to get, temporarily diverted as a result of first the purges, but then the Second World War. And eventually, a more sort of glimmering vision is produced under Khrushchev, in which not only is communism obtainable, in the relatively near future, but also the national differences among Soviet peoples will be overcome. So this is in the 50s and into the 60s, when there is an emphasis on zbliženie, this sort of growing closer together, and even sliania, the merging of Soviet peoples into, sort of one. But of course, Khrushchev had certain excesses of another nature as well, and harebrained scheming is the term that is most often was used at the time to explain why Khrushchev needed to be ousted. And so a more sober and sobering vision comes to replace that under Brezhnev, with this slogan of actually existing socialism. Of course, many jokes emanated from each of those three words, and a kind of cynicism comes much to the fore, particularly among intelligentsia, I would say, in the late 60s and much more so in the 70s and 80s. And then, of course, come the series of gerontocratic leaders, Andropov and Chernenko, and until the relatively youthful Gorbachev takes over, and well, we know the rest of the story. That's my 3 or 5 minute run through of Soviet history.
You mentioned earlier that you were interested in labor, and you have this book called Making Workers Soviet. And we discussed, of course, like whether or not the Soviet Union could or should be considered a workers' paradise. But I'm interested in this question of the transformation of the working class of the late Russian Empire into not only a bigger, by virtue of the number of workers, but also this transformation of an identity into a Soviet one. And if you could just talk a little bit about that process, what that was like, and what that means for the trajectory of the first worker state.
Okay. I'll try to be brief, but I probably won't be, because this is my life's work, more or less. Well, as I look back over the long array of Soviet history, I'm actually more and more fascinated by the early period, the first few years, because of the myriad possibilities, even in the midst of that chaos and starvation. Because, workers' power was one of the inspiring things about the revolution. What did it mean in actuality? How is it to be effectuated? Did it mean workers would take control of the means of production themselves? Well, it had never been done before, really, but now was maybe the opportunity. Or did, workers' control have a slightly less ambitious meaning? Would it just be to kind of control or check up on managers and engineers and experts and others? And then there's the question of labor productivity, which I devoted a lot of my scholarly research trying to understand. How is that to happen without the stick of capitalism and the capitalist bosses being there? So in these early years, there were a lot of things that were tried out, and some of them were very contradictory. So, for example, there were in the early 20s institutions called Comrades disciplinary courts. And then in the late 20s and early 30s, so-called production collectives and communes. And the more and more I've come to see those collectives and communes as encapsulating the most attractive features of Soviet communism. Collective responsibility among work units, sharing rewards equally as long as you're doing the best you can. And I've also come to see the suppression of these institutions that workers themselves created on the grounds that, as Stalin put it, they were petty bourgeois. They were examples of petty bourgeois egalitarianism, perpetrated by leftist blockheads, as he described them in the 17th Party Congress speech, in that Victory Congress of 1934. So the suppression of these production collectives and communes, I see as one of the tragedies of Soviet history. Now, among historians of Soviet labor, I was, and probably remain in the small minority of those who did not consider resistance as the only worthy subject when it came to Soviet workers. I recognize that Soviet workers did resist from time to time in a variety of ways. Resisting the imposition of labor discipline when it got too oppressive, resisting increased output norms, obligatory payments of various kinds. But to me, the strategy of accommodation was more pervasive and not necessarily less interesting. Actually, what do I mean by that? Workers now deprived of any collective means of asserting their influence or even redressing the imbalance of power between the state and themselves, had to resort to largely depoliticized reactions in the form of things like high turnover, absenteeism, haphazard fulfillment of orders, and most of all, seizing a significant degree of control over the individual labor process. And this, of course, set off action-reaction syndrome between them and management and political party officials. But you ask about Making Workers Soviet, and that's a book that I co-edited with my dear friend, whom you know, Ron Sunni. And the book has an interesting history. So it was published in 1994, based on a conference that took place at Michigan State University in November 1990. When this conference occurred, labor history, and I speak here not just about Soviet history, but the approach to history that emphasizes labor in general, this was in its heyday. And so Ron Sunni and I co-hosted the conference and co-edited the book. And in the preface to that book, we mentioned that the impetus came from a book called Working Class Formation, 19th Century Patterns in Western Europe and the United States. And you know, we acknowledge that this book had stimulated us to think along parallel lines about the formation of the Soviet working class. The conference and the volume attracted, without any false modesty, I'll say, the creme de la creme of historians of Russian and Soviet history, specifically labor history, including such senior scholars as Misha Levin, Reginald Zelnick, Sheila Fitzpatrick, and comparative youngsters such as Stephen Kotkin. We all thought, I can't speak for everyone, most of us thought that we were at the cutting edge in understanding Soviet working class formation, not only as a matter of assembling industrial workers in factories, but also as, and here I'm going to quote from the introduction that Ron Sunni and I wrote, a political and cultural postulate, the assertion of a particular kind of social identity, no less real than the demonstrable fact of social positions defined by relations of production. So, in other words, making workers Soviet, as the title of the volume had it, was about languages of trade becoming the language of class. It was about, and I'm now referring to contributions to the volume, white collar workers as the hidden class, of how a self-conscious and proud industrial working class got swamped by raw peasants during the first 5-year plan, when millions fleeing collectivization wound up in the wage-earning industrial working class, and of workers taking advantage of attacks on their bosses during the terror of the late 1930s. Anyway, as I mentioned a moment ago, we thought we were at the cutting edge, but it turned out we were on a ledge, or to change the metaphor, at the end of the road. Less setting an agenda for thinking about and writing Soviet history than something of a swan song. Labor history, as it turned out, had lost its cachet by the mid-1990s. It had ceased to be interesting or offer much to other historians. And although very good books would be published subsequently on the Stalin era, it seemed to me that it was time to move on. That is, to move ahead to explore other kinds of phenomena on a different methodological terrain. Now, as I've written fairly recently, labor history has had a second coming in the new millennium, thanks in part to new approaches that have expanded the meaning of labor. So there's been really good work on domestic labor, on service workers, on those involved in cultural production. And this not just in the period that making Soviet workers was about, the 20s and 30s, but I would say even more so later decades of Soviet history. And I should mention here a couple of examples, but some of which come from people concerned with Eastern Europe, with communist Eastern Europe, and indeed people from Eastern Europe who have been writing really outstanding work in recent years. I can mention names if you are interested. At the same time, there are those who, unlike me, stuck with labor history through the thick and thin. People like Wendy Goldman, Donald Filzer, who have teamed up, incidentally, to produce some really good work on material conditions during the Great Patriotic War, for example. And Don Filzer's own work has continued. And there have been labor histories of much more recent times, including even post-Soviet labor. So labor history is far from dead, but it just so happens that making Soviet workers appeared during an interim in the long array of Soviet labor history.
So you discussed miners, and I kind of want to go to you from the beginning. You said that you have traced sort of miners, whatever happened to the Donbas, the Donetsk miners, and how they have moved across the post-Soviet space, I believe you said. Yeah. Could you talk a bit about that? I find that fascinating, and I think miners being such a big part of the Soviet worker imaginary, the miners.
Right. So this was the project. This stemmed from the project that I participated in 1989 when I was invited to participate in a sister city project involving Pittsburgh and the former steel town of the US, and Donetsk. And I joined up with a couple of scholars and a scholar filmmaker by the name of Daniel Wolkowitz. And the result of this collaborative project was a film called Perestroika from Below that was produced in 1990, and a book called Workers of the Donbas Speak, which was based on interviews that we did with miners, members of their families, managerial personnel, former Komsomol activists, etc., in Donetsk, as well as, now that I recall, steel workers as well, to give us accounts of their lives, both working lives and outside of the mines. And we returned twice again, in 1990 and in 1992. The last time to actually show them the film that we had made and to get their reactions. And then I continued for about 10 years or so to track what happened to the miners' movement, which had initially taken the form of these independent strike committees to prosecute the strike against the Ministry of Coal Production in the Soviet Union. And then after the breakup of the Soviet Union, the formation of the Independent Miners Union, actually, I think now that occurred shortly before the breakup of the Soviet Union. But then in Donetsk to deal with the newly independent Ukrainian state's administration of the coal mines. So I tracked that for about 10 years, during which miners experienced non-payment of wages. That was a widespread phenomenon in those post-Soviet years. Hunger strikes, various other kinds of actions to try to rectify what had become a disastrous situation. Eventually, I lost track of the people whom I had tried to maintain contact with. And by 2014, when Donetsk and the Donbas suddenly reemerged in the world's news, it proved impossible for me to reestablish those contacts, try as I did.
I'm curious, do you remember when you were talking to any of these miners or steel workers in the post-Soviet period, how they discussed or talked about the Soviet period?
Oh, yes. So there was a lot of nostalgia. There was a lot, as Sopa was telling me earlier about people in Georgia, at one and the same time, almost in the same breath that, everyone from Stalin to Gorbachev would be denounced in the most lurid way. There would be acknowledgement and indeed a certain amount of pride in that things were relatively good. of course, that in itself is something of an indication of how bad things had become. And when I say things, I'm not just talking about material deprivation, but the kind of disorientation and sort of psychological trauma that so many people experienced in those immediate post-Soviet years. There was also a lot of naivete about what capitalism, or not, they didn't necessarily talk in terms of capitalism, but free markets or freeing of markets could do. Okay. So the notion was that coal mining was a particularly egregiously depressed industry in the Soviet Union because of it being and this was an actual term used in Soviet economic discourse, a planned loss industry. That is, the price of coal was depressed so that it could be afforded by all other industries and consumers, with the ministry and eventually the individual mining associations getting subsidies from the state to make up the difference. That was the formula, right? But for miners, this smacked of what they called ministerial feudalism. So they were serfs of the ministry that got the funds that really, in fact, belonged to them, right? So come the end of the Soviet Union and, the freeing from this feudalism, they thought that the real price of coal, if they could market the coal themselves, hunky-dory. The workers' paradise. No, I'm being facetious. That things would improve considerably. Well, it didn't turn out that way. And that's a complicated story of why not, but part of it has to do with oligarchs moving in and seizing control of the mines and manipulating prices to their advantage and keeping as much of it as they could.
But what is there a coal industry where that doesn't happen in the
world?
I don't know any mining industry in the world where it's not the same story of insanely authoritarian like businesses who run it like a mini country, that area, and completely oppress all miners. So like it's interesting because there really isn't any examples of where that's like, oh, look, everyone has some power, or the miners are finally seeing, any of their incredibly hard work and very, environmentally and for their health wise work. Same thing in Georgia, exactly. Like the worst jobs, mining, and these towns are insanely impoverished. Like there's mono economy, at least in the Soviet Union. There's supposed to be a diversification of having, a few things more, that would sort of create at least a community. And the community is completely depressed. There's just only a mine and, getting drunk or smoking weed and like trying to make it and forget about your life. And that most of the miners were like that, just trying to forget that they work this horrible job in this small town away from everyone. There's nothing around. Or gamble, another thing.
Yeah. And I mean, there are other characteristic features that, are lamentable. I'm thinking of the kind of, the gender division of labor, producing a kind of machoism among miners, that of course, a certain camaraderie, a sort of strong male bonding, but also, an inability to care about the labor of anybody else, such as to try to create solidarities this is so hard to do.
You mentioned that in Donbas and in Donetsk, these miners who had critiques of the idea of a kind of feudal relationship with the ministerial feudalism, and then that when the Soviet Union starts to collapse, them viewing the market as being some alternative to that. And what's interesting is that, if I understood you correctly, is that they were critiquing one of the social benefits that was actually making their life better, which was the depressed value of the coal. And so that to me is a really interesting contradiction. I don't know if you have any comment about that, but that's a really interesting contradiction, right? That the workers themselves are sort of posing the thing which is actually making their life, say, better than in some other position it could be.
Yeah, so there are two aspects to this that I need to mention. One is, yeah, they were sort of bought off, is one way of looking at it, in that some of the subsidies went towards what were relatively very high wages. So miners were among the highest paid workers in the Soviet Union on average. On the other hand, what they very acutely felt was that not enough of the subsidies were going into improving the conditions of mining. And mining was becoming increasingly dangerous, particularly in the Donbas, an old mining region. So they were harsh in their complaints and criticisms of the lack of reinvestment in safety, in equipment, in other technologies that could have made mining safer. The casualty and injury rates in mining are really horrific when it comes to the late Soviet period.
Doesn't that sort of limit that workers don't always know the full scope of things? Because it's like this idea of sort of romanticizing that workers like know everything and they could run things. It's a little bit limited still, because in practice, you sort of know a certain part of a bigger puzzle. And it's easy as well, especially, as a union person, if you're trying to build up a case against your boss, you're sort of willing to believe anything, right, against the boss, because you need that to sort of pump people up. And so they can be very much manipulated by other forces, like against Soviet Union. Or we can use the Chile example as a great one, against Allende, how they had miners go against Allende and start strikes at first, So like there is that limitation of like workers aren't always the most like advanced part of society at that moment, depending on, whatever the context is. Even though I would say, unfortunately, the elites were not the advanced in the Soviet Union. What was the things that they were doing?
And that's brilliant. I remember a piece I wrote with the title "Freedom of Prices and the Price of Freedom." That is, so freeing of prices was one of the big objectives of the miners, along the lines of what I explained earlier, that they assumed that, with getting the real price of coal, things would improve. Now, yeah, so the miners knew very well what their working conditions were. And, they knew very well even that they were being bought off in a way. What they didn't know, and what, is not easy to grasp for anyone, is really the larger circuit of capital, even the global circuit, that makes it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to be able to participate in the market as a worker and get the the true value of labor, of your labor. I mean, you got to be a Marxist, and that takes a lot of study, a lot of, yeah. I'm being semi-facetious. Yeah.
No, but it's true. I mean, I'm 39 and I constantly feel like I don't possess any of the knowledge I'm supposed to have to make even basic decisions. Like, it's such a difficult process. You have to learn all the time, question, re-question, question again your assertions. Then economy is so complex. If you want to even if having the most Marxist methodology and tools, you have to constantly see how things change. And it's a really difficult process to be able to understand what's happening. That's why I'm like, I generally think that I do think there's a left. Again, I think I'm one of them as well, to some degrees, that sort of romanticize and fetishize the people or workers as like all knowing, without having other people who are dedicated just to study, because it's important to have at least more of a complete picture. Because I don't know if we'll ever have a complete picture of anything. Look at the bourgeois press, right? They have millions of people dedicated to this, and they still get it wrong all the time. So they're much more well equipped than we are. But with miners, can you talk about some of the things they had? Like, I know you said there was a sister city program. You went. I was listening to Fiona Hill, who is the national advisor to Biden, or I don't know if she still is, but or to Trump at first, and then I think Biden.
Yes.
Yeah, but I think she was at I'm not sure. But anyway, so very high ranking, number one, sort of talk to some number one person, go-to person for Russia. And she discussed how she learned Russian and went to, I think, Donbas herself, because she came from a British mining community where they had the miners had the British miners and the Donbas miners had some exchange programs. And then the miners had gathered money for her to go and learn Russian and study in Soviet Union, and then which she used sort of the miners' money and the working class connections, because she's from there, to then sort of work her way up being a Russian advisor in the US, probably the highest, I don't know, office anyone can reach. So I thought that was an incredible story. I don't personally like how she used it at the end, but really, this seems like the miners had a lot of connections, like the sister city, like the other miner unions. It looks like it was really well connected, also autonomous, not only from just the leadership, but they seem to have their own community and connections themselves. Can you talk about that if you do know?
Well, I remember that we tried to discuss the experience of miners both in the US and in Britain with the miners in Donetsk. After all, remember that in the 80s, there was still this aura of the miners in Britain having been really militant, albeit eventually repressed by Thatcher. And there was some militance among miners in the US that, we had hawked up. But as far as connections are concerned, what comes to mind are the connections between Donetsk miners and miners elsewhere in the Soviet Union, particularly Kuzbas miners, and even in the far north, trying to remember, Norilsk maybe, as well as even to some extent, even because of their otherwise political differences, with miners in Western Ukraine. So this sense of, an all-union miners movement was something that was very much part of those last years of the Soviet Union. Now, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, of course, that didn't seem quite so salient. But the other thing, of course, is with workers in other kinds of industries. So there's a very good book by Stephen Crowley, who was actually part of our team, called Hot Coal, Cold Steel. And it was about why coal miners in the Soviet Union were so relatively militant and why steel workers were not. And he looked at both Donbas and Kuzbas. And, you know, the short answer is along the lines of what I was saying earlier about the planned loss nature of the coal mine industry, and that steel workers, you know, were a little less under the thumb of the ministries responsible for steelmaking. Had a little more autonomy.
Sorry, the coal miners were really well paid, though, right?
Yes.
So why were they not complain, but why would they have any problems with?
Because it was dangerous and increasingly dangerous work. Because you know, the old images of heroic miners, Stakhanov and others, were wearing very thin. And, you know, their ambitions were to gain control via the market.
How would that help them be more safe? Like, that's how is controlling the market? This sort of things that I get asked all the time, because when we ask for things, they're like, how does this make sense?
At the time, there was not much awareness, at least in that part of the world, of, you know, the ecological damage and devastation of mining, but certainly a need for improved technology. The mines were incredibly deep, and you know, better equipment and better safety conditions. All of this was very much in the forefront. And the notion was that if they got the true value of the coal that they sold, or that their mining associations sold, that more could be invested in safety and equipment and so forth. Now, you know, in retrospect, you would want to say more could be invested in alternative sources of energy, that they would then be a part of the decision-making process and not left out, hung out to dry. I mean, this is the kind of discussions that go on in this country about, you know, why do Appalachian miners vote so consistently Republican? Because, you know, the Democrats talk about green energy and the Green New Deal and what's in it for them. Well, if they were part of the process, maybe something would be in it for them.
So really, co-management would have probably eased up on some of those things.
Absolutely, that's right. Yeah.
That's a really interesting point.
Being part of the decision-making process, absolutely.
And also made them realize that their industry wasn't as lucrative as they thought by being part of the management. Okay, that's a really interesting point. Thank you so much for that. Were there particular demands by the workers of co-management?
Yes.
Yes. So like everywhere, and so, you know, there was a demand for a co-management as one of them.
There was this institution under Gorbachev called something like Labor Collective, but that's not the right term. It's
this is during Perestroika, right?
Yes, during Perestroika, which, you know, the miners regarded as window dressing, as, you know, really not serious, but they seized the opportunity presented by these damn, I wish I could remember the term, to infuse them with worker participation. Council of Labor Collectives, they were called Councils of Labor Collectives, right? Soviety Trudovых коллективов. And they held elections to these, and it was management elected its members, and the workers, I remember exactly whether it was dependent on the union or not, elected theirs. And so these councils of labor collectives, anyway, I dare say you can find a lot about this in the Workers of the Donbas Speak book, where it's discussed at some length. Yeah, and that was about co-management.
Was there any kind of phenomena before perestroika that had similar demands? When you were studying sort of the different ways that the workers, instead of resisted, accommodated, in those times, was there an attempt before perestroika to formulate this kind of demand?
Well, what I know best are those production collectives and communes I spoke of earlier, going back to the 20s and early 30s. But this is in the context of a really basic sort of, fork in the road, where relying on tried and true methods of capitalist, technology and expertise was one of the forks, and the other was to try to create something new. And, there is this scientific management of labor movement that was all of it. Taylorism is the popular term, right? Time and motion studies, relying on the expertise of engineers to study the minutia of labor activity. All of that comes to become part of Soviet labor practice to the expense of, or at the expense of, any really collective worker participation. Now, I'm sure there are initiatives in later decades that I should know more about, but nothing quite as momentous or as potentially distinct as those or late 20s, early 30s phenomena.
So one of the most interesting things is like Georgia mines. All the equipment is from the Soviet era. No upgrades really for the past 30 years. They say sometimes when they do bring a new machine, it breaks very quickly. So they just rely on the tried and tested methods of Stalin era equipment often. And they have increased their time in the mines. Like example is actually the coal mines and manganese mines, where manganese, they want to have the workers for 12 hours underground or in the mine, instead of what in the Soviet era was 7 hours. And all these institutes, like occupational health and labor medicine would forbid, more than 7 hours because it's so bad for your health. And even the accidents in coal mines have gotten really bad. A lot of people died because during the Soviet era, actually, they had walled off certain sections because they were so dangerous. It was like easy to mine there, but it was also more dangerous because they were sort of pursuing profit. They'd removed the safety, like hatch or whatever it was that was covering them. And then a lot of the workers, they died, exploded. So it's interesting to see that. Now in Georgia also, we don't have any more labor medicine or institute. It's been completely gone. It's what's the word? Not banned, erased, like it doesn't exist. Disbanded. There you go. That's a better word. So there's nothing to monitor what happens in these mines, especially long-term health and safety. And so it's one of the most unsafe places now to work, even worse, way worse than in the Soviet Union. And not even discussing how they don't even throw and dispose the coal anymore in the back of the mountains. They put it right in front of the residential areas and things like that happen. So it's quite. I don't know about like what Georgia miners were like before the Soviet Union. They're ones who work there still, and they of course have nostalgia, and they constantly talk about how much better it was during the Soviet Union. They're actually the ones that made me rethink. It was actually miners that made me rethink about Soviet Union as being, totally bad. And they were the ones telling me how they had extra food because they were miners. They had more time to relax and sent to sanatoriums and, less time in the mines and like all these like really, I wouldn't say workers' paradise, but it was pretty like comparatively to what I knew.
Yeah,
miners.
We went with them we went with the Donetsk miners to the Kurort, and it was really, really nice. And I haven't been to such nice places very often. Yeah.
It was palaces for the workers. I mean, there's still some there that we still have here. I mean, most of them are, of course, just standing there empty or being sold to like 5-star hotels. But when you look at the architecture, I mean, it really was attempting to build beautiful places that used to be only for the rich, for the working class. So maybe that's like the story that never really gets told. A lot of these, like especially a lot of labor books or people who are like talk about Soviet labor, they never really mention the also the like luxury that came with it. So many special stores and breaks and things that's unimaginable to me at this point of, what West Virginia miners were dying in poverty and like ever having access to sanatoriums like we have. Like that's unimaginable to me.
There's a good book by my friend Diane Conker called Club Red, which is it's about the sanatoria, and she got some very good material to work with for that.
There is this kind of image sometimes of the Soviet Union as being a place that was short on goods or people starving, when of course we all know here that that's not the case for the majority of the history. And I know that, Lewis, you wrote a book about the Soviet automobile, and you have some other things written about consumption practices in the USSR. And so I guess my question is, as somebody who studied the production of the Soviet automobile and the consumption or purchasing of the Soviet automobile and what its effect on Soviet society was, I mean, what does the Soviet automobile mean in the Soviet story, and how did it, affect Soviet society, and how do you view its place in the development of a more consumption-oriented kind of mature socialism?
Yeah. So I came to write this book called Cars for Comrades. Sometime in the late 90s, when I was in Moscow, I started noticing how ubiquitous cars had become. I mean, not just the traffic, but cars parked on sidewalks for lack of parking spaces in the streets, and TV ads and billboards advertising both Russian and foreign-made cars and so forth. And I suddenly began to wonder, about cars in the Soviet period. Why were they so relatively rare? Were they incompatible with Soviet socialism? Did their status as the most sort of iconic consumer item of 20th century capitalism have anything to do with it? And what of the relatively few Soviet cars that were produced? Were they really so inferior to those made elsewhere in the world, as their reputation suggested? And if so, why? And who owned those cars? And how did they acquire them and service them? So all of those questions inspired the book that I wrote. And another was that after spending most of my career writing about the Stalin era and then the collapse of the Soviet Union, I wanted to do a broader project, more chronologically comprehensive, something that in fact would span the entire Soviet period. And then this is also when I became more interested in the history of material culture and consumption. So for several years during the new millennium, I did little else but think about Soviet cars. And this meant immersing myself in the enormous literature on the history of cars in general, design, production, consumption, learning about all kinds of car-related stuff. And I also want to say a new vocabulary, since my knowledge of Russian up to that point had not included various car parts and things of that sort. It meant reading every issue I could of the Soviet car magazine called Za Rulyom, Behind the Wheel, which started publication in 1928. And it meant poring over novels and movies in which cars were central. I'll skip the titles. It meant traveling twice to Tolyatti, the car town on the Volga, home of the Volga automobile factory, Vaz, which mass-produced eventually the quintessential Soviet car, the Lada, or Zhiguli, which was actually a knockoff of the Fiat 124. I visited, the assembly line, and I talked with technical personnel, and I took part in 2 conferences that Vaz sponsored. And so, okay, so what was the book about? I decided that the book would move from production to consumption, with a spinal chapter in the middle on roads. So the 3 production chapters would be anchored by the locations of the principal factories. So there's a chapter on the Moscow factory, ZIS, which then became ZIL, so the factory named after Stalin, which in the early 60s was renamed the factory after Likhachov, who was the longtime director of that factory, and which produced a series of originally Ford knockoff cars, and then the iconic Chaika, the long limousine. Nizhny Novgorod, or Gorky, where the Gorky automobile factory was built in the early 30s. That was a Ford project. And then finally Tolyatti. So each would begin with the founding of the enterprise and work toward the present, each of those 3 chapters. The chapter on roads would encompass the entire Soviet period and include efforts to overcome what was called бездорожье, or roadlessness. trying to remember that slogan that was something like, roads are expensive, but roadlessness is more expensive. And in Russian, it's дорога дорогой, бездорожье дороже. Yeah. And the ways in which road construction was popularized and all kinds of roads were, the building of roads were celebrated. And finally, there would be two chapters chronologically organized on the material culture and consumption of cars. The first from the Revolution up to the Great Patriotic War, and the second from the war to the end of the Soviet Union. But of course, that wasn't the end of the story as far as my attempt to understand cars and as sort of material culture and consumption objects in the Soviet Union. So in the midst of writing that book, I edited a book on private spheres in Soviet Russia, which I called Borders of Socialism. And that came about when I suddenly realized that quite a few people were working on different aspects of private space, and that one of the under-investigated aspects of Soviet life was this very interesting distinction between private space and that is частное, and the personal. So personal and private meant two different things in Soviet discourse. Personal was fine and legal. Private was frowned upon and often illegal. So people could buy cars. That was their personal property, supposedly. It was not their private property. That is to say, it was not to be used for income-deriving activity. Yeah. Refrigerators were personal property, just like cars. This was the Soviet legal system. Other contributions to this volume on private spheres included the so-called private plots that peasants, collective farm families had, or again, actually, the legal term was personal subsidiary plots, right? Not private. The cooperative enterprises in the Soviet Union, and the one that was the focus was the Palyech cooperative. That's where they made those black lacquer boxes in this village called Palyech. Pet keeping, pet ownership. The state efforts to standardize domestic space and furnishings. So this is kind of the intervention of the state, particularly under Khrushchev. And the last contribution, I think, had to do with the proto-hippie movement of the 50s and 60s in the Baltic states, republics. My own contribution to that volume, other than the theoretical introduction, was an essay called Cars, Cars, and More Cars, the Faustian Bargain of the Brezhnev Era. And I meant that, so I associated two things with the Faustian bargain. One is that for the Soviet state, and particularly party ideologists, to ramp up production and consumption of cars was necessary because of the tremendous, intense desire for cars that emanated from Soviet urban society. But that it was very problematic, because no matter how stringently the border between the personal and the private was patrolled, there was no way that authorities could prevent people from using cars to make money.
What ways was the Soviet state, I guess, as cars were becoming more widely distributed amongst the population, like how was the Soviet state encouraging, especially in late socialism, people to use cars? I mean, were there campaigns, I think if I remember correctly, campaigns for, going on road trips or using the cars for personal ways? And what were those like?
Yeah. So auto tourism was something that was celebrated as a kind of civilizing or modernizing activity. There were so there's this big auto club that is this kind of semi-state voluntary society that projected images of road culture. And so, but it's not so much trying to get people to buy cars, because demand always outstripped supply. They couldn't produce cars fast enough. The waiting time to get cars barely diminished over the long haul of those last Soviet decades. It was years and years. And, as fast as they could turn them out, there were no auto showrooms to, think about whether I wanted a car or not, or try out this or that. You put in your order years in advance.
The Soviet Union obviously emphasized the creation of public transit, marshrutkas, metro, electrichka, all this kind of, pretty developed, especially compared to the US, public transit. So what was the relationship and dynamic between public transit infrastructure in Soviet cities and the increase in car ownership? How did they deal with, for example, how did they navigate the overlap, the tensions, or maybe the complementary infrastructure? Because I'm thinking, of course, about a city like Los Angeles in the United States, where the entire city was built for cars, right? And so you have Soviet cities that didn't necessarily, that were being built in ways that weren't expecting necessarily, or didn't have in mind in an ideological way or necessarily infrastructural way, the expansion of car ownership. So how did that work?
So I talked about why a Faustian bargain is a good metaphor for the state's motivations, right? So they wanted to be able to provide cars to some extent, at least, to try to satisfy some of the demand. But, on the other hand, that meant a lot of people engaging in private activity, like, picking up people and charging them for rides, and other ways in which cars were being used illegally. And also, it meant people devoting more and more time to their own cars rather than engaging in sort of public collective activity. But there's also the other dimension to the Faustian bargain, and that is owning a car in the Soviet Union was a Faustian bargain, because, okay, you finally got your car, but where are you going to get it repaired? And where are you going to even fill it up with petrol? And, where are you going to keep it overnight? And because all of that infrastructure was so underdeveloped. There were so few petrol stations in the major cities. And there were so few that, in fact, standard practice of car owners was to do deals with truck drivers who got supplies of fuel to run the trucks that they could then siphon off for a price to fill up the tanks of car owners. And, this kind of deal making and hiring of people to fix cars because there were so few places so the infrastructure is really lacking, and the alternative activities really kind of mushroom. And this feeds into the whole phenomenon of the so-called second economy, right? This is a major phenomenon of the late Soviet period. This off the books shadow economy, it's been termed, using parts from your workplace to take home to fix this or that, or to lend for a price, the swapping of favors, blot, all of this is very much connected to the emergence of a car economy.
Did you by chance look into Soviet exports of vehicles?
A little bit, yes. So I'm aware of it. Yeah.
Yeah, just because, there are certain Soviet products. Obviously, the AK-47 is probably the most famously exported Soviet-made good. But Soviet vehicles, too, of course, made their way to various countries and are now mainstay in certain places. And, I'm curious, what did you find about the significance, both in terms of, exporting the image of the USSR, building relations with other countries? What role did the vehicle play?
So the Lada, of course, is the one that was exported most, and it had a niche of sorts in Western Europe, in Britain, even in Finland. And the niche was as the first car for, young people, not, who couldn't afford more expensive cars because the price was quite low. Of course, the Lada was built to be self-repaired because of the shortage of repair facilities, but also because of how often it tended to break down, how many times one needed to replace parts, and it had a simple stroke engine that lent itself to self repair. So other than those countries, I think there were intentions of exporting it to the United States, but the Yugo beat it out. So this is the Yugoslav made car. And that was not very long lasting itself.
Can I ask how much this car cost? I'm sorry. First, do you remember about how much?
So in the Soviet Union or abroad?
In the Soviet Union.
In the Soviet Union, yes. So I'm about 6,000 rubles, which doesn't sound like much today, of course, but in Soviet times was about, I think, I'm remembering something like 3 times the annual salary. Does that make sense? An average salary. I should.
If it's so expensive, how are people affording it?
Yeah.
How is there such a huge demand?
Pooling, familial, and years of accumulation, and unfortunately, there was very little in the way of down payment systems in the Soviet Union. I wanted to mention also that, between public transportation and car ownership, there was a brief attempt under Khrushchev for a system of renting cars that, really had, in my view, a lot going for it, but it was very unpopular. It did not satisfy many people at all. But, the notion was, why should a car sit unused for much of the time when, a single owner is not using it? Why not? It's much more rational to make it available to people who want to, who need a car from 8 p.m. to 11 p.m. when, this kind of thing. It lasted for less than a decade and, was highly criticized.
You mentioned, obviously, you'd spent a lot of time studying miners, and you also talked about how you made it to the car factories in the USSR, the Togliatti factory. And one thing I'm kind of interested in is miners are producing something very important, but it's not a consumer good. And then the workers who are working on the factory line at an auto plant are producing this, very desirable consumer good. And so did the difference in the commodity being produced affect the workers' vision of themselves, understanding of their worth and importance? And did that play into any aspect of kind of like Soviet working class culture? The difference between, say, the working class culture of the miners and the working class culture politically and on the ground in a auto factory, which is a more modern factory type situation.
Right. So Soviet car production, really does depend on the technologies that had been developed elsewhere when they get started. And, that's essentially means the assembly line. And so these are largely assembly line workers. In the case of, for example, Gaz in Nizhny Novgorod, none other than Walter and Victor Ruther, the heads of the United Automobile Workers Union, who were Ford workers, come over in the late 30s and provide their expertise teaching workers how to work on the assembly line. So it's, of course, a very different kind of labor that they're engaged in. It's very time specific and time and motion specific, I should say, in a way that is really quite different from mining. I think there were labor heroes, however, along the lines of the Stakhanovite movement. And it's also a much more urban existence. I think this is the other difference I would stress. Yeah. So, there are whole districts of Moscow to this day that are, Proletarsky Rayon, for example, it's an auto town within Moscow. But, there is Moscow. And similarly with Togliatti, although, I called it a car town, actually Togliatti is a town of a lot of industries, but and although not a capital city by any means, it's large enough to feel urban. So I'd say those are the two principal differences.
Yeah, I think the insights have been really good. I really personally like the whole miners, discussing miners and consumption. I think they're both really interesting, important topics. I think one of the things I always want to ask, not ask, but I think about all the time, with sort of Anthropocene, like this in more environmental, ecological approach to Marxism. it's sort of what Soviet Union was doing in the sense of not having as many consumptive goods, right? Was actually environmentally what people are trying to, right? So a lot of the, not entire, but I think a lot of the critique of Soviet Union rests on this whole consumption goods all the time, right? It's the way showing these like insanely beautiful like supermarkets decorated with like millions of products, and then that as opposed to the Soviet Union. I don't know what you said, but yeah. Or yeah, exactly. Like, oh, like Soviet leaders visit US and are like, oh my God, why aren't we capitalists yet? Like, so it's been 30 years and we are now more and more certain of our doom, of global doom, because of this unregulated consumption. And not only is it environmentally bad and it's going to maybe kill us all, but also it's shown to have terrible psychological elements of overconsumption and so much constantly choosing what to buy and buying and buying. And it's also just made us these huge consumers in everything we do. So there's many reasons to be against consumption, at least this level of consumption. Everyone I know who was alive during the Soviet Union, including me as a kid, we had pretty much everything one needs. I eat almost the same food I would be eating in the Soviet Union, right? Sometimes I have an avocado or something, or banana, but mostly it's the same stuff. We love hachapuri cheese bread, which we had, the walnuts with, egg, with the eggplant walnuts and so on and so on. It's the same. I drink the same tea, like really not that much different. And I don't need to eat all these manufactured goods because actually they're bad for you and leads to obesity and problems and health problems. So with knowing all this now, or at least some parts of the world has acknowledged it, some parts are still fighting the global warming thing, but knowing that degrowth, communism or degrowth socialism, in maybe to evaluate the Soviet Union from the 2023 lens, in that instead of say 1990 lens or 1980 lens or 1970 lens. That would be my sort of last question. I know it's a long question. I apologize.
No, I entirely agree, and we should do more of that. The only problem I can think of is that it runs up against the unfortunate fact that so much of Soviet ideology was growth oriented, right? We're going to outproduce. We're going to, we become the largest producer of, steel, whatever it was. And, that was a source of pride. And I mean, so there has to be a way of acknowledging that, but also acknowledging what you're pointing to is that for most people, most of the time, in most places, the kind of self-contained, limited consumption that they experienced has something to say for it.
What do you think, as somebody coming from the left who spent all of this time, spent your whole life studying the Soviet past, what do you think an interrogation or investigation of the Soviet story can offer us today?
I think what it offers is that the Soviet model, such as it were, or such as we might call it, was a first try. And inevitably, first tries are mistaken in many ways, are excessive, are inadequate, precisely because they are first tries. And of course, it gets imposed on other countries, and it distorts even those versions of socialism that react against it in some ways. But looking 30 some odd years now beyond, it should not be dismissed, written off, put to rest, as it were. We need to draw upon it, and keep on reassessing. And even as difficult as this may be to accommodate, be inspired. There's so much of what you and Sopa have talked about that I find it inspiring. So I am really grateful.
Zazori Mewadroneli Anzori da Sashi Almoxtifti Iso Gazos Swifti Darrande nit Khaushi Yaris Kuisha Im Denizelig Wilgos Misha Mikwas